Thank you, Joe, for the lovely introduction. My name is Adrian. Oops. I'm a research associate at GLSEN. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm going to be talking about Latinx LGBTQ students in US schools and their experiences with homophobic and racist victimization. If you want to tweet along with us, you can tweet at GLSEN, tag us at GLSEN Research. Please feel free to tag us. And then, of course, I know that because CES is virtual this year, we've got the hashtag VCIES to tweet along as well. If you were here for the last panel, then this will be a bit of a repeat, but GLSEN is an organization, leading national education organization focused on ensuring safe schools for all students. We've been around since 1990, and GLSEN envisions a world in which every child learns to respect and accept all people regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity or expression. We do that work through research, through educational resources and training, student leadership initiatives, and policy work, public awareness campaigns. And then we could not do our work without the help of volunteer-run state and local chapters across the country. The GLSEN Research Institute is housed within GLSEN, and the Research Institute has been around since 1999, supporting the organization's mission by conducting original research on issues of sexual orientation and gender identity expression, so G issues, in K-12 schools, as well as evaluating GLSEN's programs and initiatives. This work started with the National School Climate Survey back in 1999, and we do that every 2 years, although we've also released lots of other reports, a sampling of which you can see at the bottom of this slide. And then relevant for this conference, we also provide technical assistance, not just to our GLSEN chapters and other safe school advocates, but also to other NGOs across the globe who wish to conduct similar local research on LGBTQ student experiences. So that's an overview of GLSEN and the Research Institute. I'm going to go over a bit of background around the topic that we're covering today. So we know from existing literature that youth of color in general in the US often experience racism at school. And specifically with regard to Latinx LGBTQ students, we know that in the US, and particularly as of late, although it's not a unique experience in the past few years, but particularly as of late, there's a lot of anti-immigrant rhetoric and policy in the US that has helped to fuel antipathy towards Latinx folks, including Latinx youth. And that this really gets mixed together with racism and racist bias to really exacerbate these issues, regardless of students' immigration status or individuals' integration status. And that Latinx students in schools specifically experience pretty disproportionately low rates of high school graduation, which may be linked to some of a lot of the race-based harassment they're experiencing in schools. We also know that LGBTQ students generally experience frequent homophobia and transphobia at schools. We at the Institute have been studying this for a long time. We know that this is a common phenomenon for LGBTQ students. And we also know from our data that these experiences are linked to poor psychosocial well-being and poor academic outcomes. But there's really not a lot of research out there about Latinx LGBTQ students and what their experiences are like in schools. So this is a bit of a trying to look further into the intersection of those identities of Latinx students who identify as LGBTQ. And if we look at this through an intersectional framework using Kimberly Crenshaw's intersectionality, we can make the assertion that the Latinx LGBTQ students are probably experiencing both racist harassment and anti-LGBTQ harassment that's targeting both of these identities. And further, with this intersectional framework, it's really difficult to disentangle harassment that is targeting race and harassment that's targeting LGBTQ identity, and that not only are there going to be cumulative effects from harassment that targets both identities, but that these, each one kind of impacts the other and creates a really unique experience for Latinx LGBTQ students. So with all of that in mind, the purpose of this paper was to first look at what are the cumulative effects of racist bias or racist harassment and homophobic harassment on psychosocial well-being for Latinx LGBTQ students. But in addition to the cumulative the additive effects of these different forms of harassment, how does race-based harassment impact the effects of homophobic harassment? So how does experiencing racism in school kind of impact and maybe change the effects of homophobic bias in schools for Latinx LGBTQ students? Talk about a bit about the sample and methods behind this paper. The data that we used for the analysis came from GLSEN's 2017 National School Climate Survey, which the full report you can see is the cover on the left here. Find it at glsen.org/NSCS. The survey was targeted for LGBTQ secondary school students. It was made available online, and outreach was done via targeted Facebook ads, Instagram ads, Snapchat ads, or Facebook and Instagram ads, social media posts, organizational contacts, email lists. For this particular study, in this survey, participants were asked to identify their race ethnicity in our survey and check all that apply. And one of those options, we asked about race and ethnicity in a single question, and one of those options was Hispanic or Latinx. And this particular study includes any student who identified as Latinx, whether or not they just checked Latinx or they checked off Latinx and something else, they were included in this sample. The final sample included 3,352 Latinx LGBTQ students. And on the left here, just showing off here the cover of a report that was just released a couple weeks ago, which is kind of our larger report on Latinx LGBTQ student experiences. And I'm kind of going a bit more in depth into one small aspect of that report. So this is a kind of broad overview of some of the demographic characteristics of the sample that was used in this paper. So about 45% were identified as gay or lesbian, and a similar percentage, 46%, identified as either bisexual or pansexual. And then the rest of the students identifying as queer, another sexual orientation, or questioning their sexual orientation. For gender, the way that I treated and talked and looked at gender for this analysis, in terms of using it as a covariate at least, was just looking at whether students identified as transgender, non-binary, another gender non-conforming identity, or if they identified as cisgender, their sex assigned at birth was aligned with their gender identity. And a little more than half identified as cisgender, and a little more than 2/5, 43%, identified as trans, non-binary, or another GNC identity. There's an average age of 15.6 years. About half of the sample identified only as Latinx, and the other half identified with multiple races and ethnicities. And then we have a breakdown of locale, about a quarter in rural small towns, a little over a third in urban suburban areas. I also just wanted to point out that because a lot of the racism that Latinx students experience is often wrapped up in issues of immigration and xenophobia, that the vast majority of the sample were US citizens, and about 85.9% of the sample did learn English as one of their first languages, which is, could be another indicator of foreignness to peers. So the variables that we use to look at when I looked at psychosocial well-being for this group, that was, I kind of used depression, self-esteem, and school belonging, which are all measured in multi-item scales in the survey. When looking at the cumulative effects of homophobic and racist harassment, I created a categorical variable with 4 different categories. Either students experienced neither homophobic or racist victimization, they only experienced homophobic, they only experienced racist, or they experienced both forms of victimization. So there's one categorical variable that I use as the independent variable there. And then controlling for grade, multiracial or multi-ethnic status, their sexual orientation, transgender identity, and locale. And then when I looked at the interactive effects, basically used all the same variables, but instead of using that categorical variable about which was, ever experiencing these forms of harassment, the independent variables here and the moderating variable were continuous scales of victimization for sexual orientation and victimization based on race ethnicity, both centered, and then I introduced an interaction term for the regression analysis. And this is a summary of the analysis for this paper. The additive effects, I used a multivariate analysis of covariance to look at depression and self-esteem, and an analysis of covariance to look at school belonging. And for the interactive effects, I use three different hierarchical linear regressions, each examining a different outcome, which I'll talk about the steps in just a moment. First, though, I'm going to talk about just what the results were, looking at the cumulative effects of these two different forms of victimization. So the results of the MANCOVA and the ANCOVA are here. And you can see in the chart on the left, these, so the turquoise bars for each of these outcomes are, these are the students who experience both racist and homophobic harassment at school. And you can see for depression, they have the highest levels of depression, they have the lowest levels of self-esteem, and the lowest levels of school belonging. These are the students who are experiencing the poorest outcomes when it comes to psychosocial well-being. And then the kind of like peach salmon colored bar that's on the left, these are the students who didn't experience either form of victimization, and unsurprisingly, they are faring the best. All three outcomes, both MANCOVA and ANCOVA were significant, and the two orange bars in the middle, those are the students who experienced either only racist or only homophobic victimization. We didn't see significant differences between them, but they're kind of like in the middle there. So then next, looking at the regression that I ran to look at the interactive effects of homophobic and racist victimization. So in the regression, we have the independent variables were, again, depression, self-esteem, school belonging. And in step one of each regression, I introduced the demographic variables as covariates. Step two, I introduced the centered victimization variables. And then in step three, I introduced an interaction term, which was homophobic victimization by racist victimization. And these are the results of the regression analysis. So these are all the betas, and just going to call your attention to the victimization variables and the interaction term. You can see that for all three outcomes, depression, self-esteem, and school belonging, both victimization based on sexual orientation and based on race ethnicity were significant for all three outcomes. And the interaction term, the interaction between these forms of victimization, was also significant for all three outcomes. And you can also see that the direction is essentially the same as well each time. Depression, the direction is the opposite. That's because, more depression is a bad thing, whereas more self-esteem and more school belonging are good things. So essentially, conceptually, they're all going in the same direction. And they all have kind of the same direction of interaction as well. Kind of a secondary thing that we noticed as well here is that the betas for victimization based on race were all lower than those for sexual orientation. So there may be a difference in effect size here in terms of the effect of homophobic victimization on these outcomes versus the effect of racist victimization. So this is the interaction. I just wanted to visualize it so that you guys can kind of see what this interaction looks like between homophobic and racist victimization. So if we look at this chart, the way that we look at it is the finer lines are racist. The weight of the line is kind of how much racist victimization students are experiencing, and then moving from left to right, we go from low to high homophobic victimization. And I just picked school belonging as an example here because it's kind of easiest to see visually. But if we look at the finer line, the thinner line, students who are experiencing not as much racist victimization in school, they are, for them, the effect of homophobic victimization is steeper. It's a stronger effect. Whereas for those who are experiencing higher levels of racist victimization, it's actually a shallower effect. There is still an effect going on, but that effect is not as strong as for students who are experiencing lower levels of racist victimization. And again, we can kind of see how there may be an indication from this chart that homophobic victimization might have a stronger effect on well-being, because we can see on the left that students with high levels of racist victimization, but low levels of homophobic victimization might be doing better than the students who have low levels of racist victimization, but high levels of homophobic victimization. So just kind of wrapping this up and looking at discussing the results as a whole, we found that both homophobic and racist victimization were associated with poor well-being, and those experiencing both forms of victimization had the poorest well-being. And finally, that those experiencing racist victimization may be better at coping with homophobic victimization. And I want to sit with this discussion point for just a moment because it is a little more nuanced, and I feel like the so what of this is it might be not as easily, not as intuitive in terms of grasping. So I just kind of wanted to illustrate it with these two hypothetical students. You see student 1 is experiencing homophobic harassment and it's impacting their level of depression. The student 2 is experiencing both racist and homophobic harassment, and it is also affecting their depression. And you can see that their level of depression is even higher. But what's I feel like what this discussion point around the kind of like difference in coping skills really underscores is the fact that we really need to pay attention to both racist and homophobic harassment for these students. Because if we're only paying attention to homophobic harassment, and we're not paying attention to this racist harassment, what this can easily look like is that student 2 is doing better than student 1, which is of course not the case. In fact, student 2 is doing worse than student 1 if you pay attention to the multiple forms of victimization they're experiencing. And so it's really important for folks to think holistically about students' multiple marginalized identities, and that may include even beyond race and sexual orientation, it also includes gender, immigration status, disability, and other identities as well. There were some limitations to the study. The sample is only representative of those who identified as LGBTQ and doesn't include those who might be attracted to the same sex or multiple genders but don't identify as LGBTQ. It only reflects student experiences for those who are in school during the 2016-2017 school year. So those who might have dropped out before then were not included in the sample. Also, homophobic victimization and racist victimization were measured on slightly different scales because the survey is more about LGBTQ issues. We get a little more nuance in terms of the way that we measure that scale and can really look more deeply at severity of victimization, whereas the racist victimization is measured as just frequency of harassment the students experience. But the conclusions, there were kind of recommendations that this brings to mind are that educators should be receiving training, professional development, and pre-service training to intervene on incidents of bias targeting both race and LGBTQ identity, and just being able to recognize and respond to the needs of multiple marginalized students. And anti-bullying policies and other policies in schools to address these multiple marginalized identities and recognize these multiple marginalized identities as well. And that researchers should really, as I was mentioning earlier, just recognize these multiple forms of victimization that students are experiencing, but also to further explore the complexities of what this means to experience anti-LGBTQ bias as a student of color, what it means to experience racist bias as an LGBTQ student, and kind of, you know, even qualitatively, what is going on there in terms of coping and things like that. And I think that I'm running up against time, which is good because I am done. So thank you all. Again, my name is Adrian. This is my email address. Also, if you want to learn more about our Youth of Color reports, you can go to glsen.org/youth of color and tweet at us as well.